The law office belonging to a group of caring experts called Patterson and Associates was located on the third floor of a beautiful old brick building in the heart of downtown Portland. On that day, the sky was a soft, misty gray, and I arrived 15 minutes early, just like I always do for everything in my life. The woman at the front desk gave me a polite smile that didn't quite reach her eyes and told me they were already waiting for me in conference room B. I gave her a small nod and began walking down the long hallway, my shoes making no sound at all on the thick, soft carpet. Through the clear glass walls of the meeting room, I could see my entire family already gathered together. My parents, David and Susan Chun, were sitting close to each other. My older sister Victoria, who always looks like she just stepped off a magazine cover, was there alongside my younger brother Marcus. Even my Uncle Wei and Aunt Lynn had made the trip. They were all laughing and sharing some private joke, looking like a happy family in a movie. But when I pushed the door open and stepped inside, the laughter stopped instantly. "Oh," Victoria said, her perfectly shaped eyebrows moving up her forehead. "You actually decided to show up?" I took a deep breath and sat down at the very far end of the long table. "Of course I came," I said quietly. "Grandma passed away. I wanted to be here for her." Marcus made a low, grumbling sound meant to be heard. "I am surprised you even knew she was gone. It is not like you ever came to visit her." I folded my hands in my lap and said nothing. There was no reason to explain myself to them. They didn't know that for the last 3 years, I had called Grandma on video every single morning. They didn't know about the hours we spent talking about her old memories, her village, her life. She had spent those mornings teaching me Mandarin, and in return, I showed her how to look at pretty pictures of gardens on Instagram. It was our special world, and it was one my family had never been part of. They didn't know that I was the first person the nurse called when Grandma's breathing changed, or that I had stayed on the phone with her during her very last hour, whispering that I loved her in both English and Mandarin, so she would feel safe and not alone. When the lawyer, Robert Patterson, walked in, my family leaned forward in their seats like they were about to be handed something they had been waiting for their whole lives. He was a kind-looking man in his 60s, carrying a large leather bag, and after checking everyone's identification, he sat down and opened a thick pile of papers. When he reached me, he paused. "Ah, Miss Lauren Chun. Your grandmother talked about you quite a lot." Victoria's eyes narrowed into slits. Mr. Patterson explained that Grandma had owned 9 rental properties in Portland, worth approximately $4.2 million. The room went so quiet you could hear a pin drop. He then explained that before discussing the properties, he was required by the terms of the will to read a letter Grandma had written in her own handwriting. Victoria waved her hand and told him to just get to the point about who was getting what, but Mr. Patterson was firm. The letter was part of the legal will, and it would be read from start to finish. He opened the white envelope and began. Grandma's words filled the room like she was still alive and sitting among us. She wrote that she had watched each member of the family closely over the last 5 years, and had seen how they acted when they thought no one was looking. She told Victoria that she had visited only twice in 3 years, and both times had only talked about the buildings, asking when Grandma would sell them to make her life simpler, never once asking if she was in pain. She told Marcus that his calls always came with offers to help manage her money, but he never asked about her books, her garden, or her friends. She told my parents that they had raised Victoria and Marcus to look at her like a bank, every conversation circling back to what she would leave behind, instead of how she was living while she was still here. And then she wrote about me. She wrote that when I moved to Seattle, everyone said I had left the family behind and didn't care. But I was the one who called every single day. I was the one who learned Mandarin so I could speak to her in the words that felt most like home when she was tired. I remembered every story she ever told and asked to hear them again. I loved her for who she was, not for what she owned. So she had made a choice. In 2019, she had placed all 9 buildings into a legal trust. The only person who would benefit from that trust was me. To Victoria and Marcus, she left her jewelry and furniture worth about $30,000. To my parents, she left her love and her blessing. To me, she left everything else. The silence that followed was crushing. Then Victoria slammed her hand on the table and exploded. She pointed at me and accused me of lying to Grandma, of turning her against the family, of manipulating an old woman. Mr. Patterson calmly explained that 2 doctors had confirmed Grandma was completely sound in her mind when she signed the papers. The will was legal, finished, and could not be changed. "You could have made those calls up," Victoria said when I showed her 3 years of video call records on my phone, over 1,000 consecutive days, each lasting an hour or more. "Why would I?" I asked. "The real question is why none of you actually called her." Mr. Patterson cleared his throat and opened another folder. He explained that Grandma had also requested a thorough audit of how the buildings had been managed. The 9 properties brought in about $14,500 every month, over $170,000 a year. But the records given to Grandma showed only $98,000 annually. Over 5 years, roughly $380,000 had quietly disappeared. Victoria had managed 4 buildings, Marcus 3, and my parents 2. Their agreements entitled them to 10% of the income for their work. Instead, they had been keeping 44% for themselves. "You were stealing from Grandma," I said. The words felt like stones in my mouth. But Grandma had known. She had hired a private investigator. She had watched what they spent and kept careful notes. Victoria had bought a car with $47,000 in cash. Marcus had taken 3 lavish trips to Las Vegas on a modest salary. My parents had renovated their kitchen for $78,000 with cash deposits that matched exactly what was missing from their 2 buildings. And then Mr. Patterson read the final instruction. If the family accepted the will gracefully, the evidence of the theft would remain sealed. But if anyone tried to contest the will or treated me poorly, he was to hand everything over to the police. Victoria called it blackmail. I told her it was Grandma protecting me, even now that she was gone. Victoria contested the will anyway. The judge threw the case out in 2 weeks. Because she had violated the condition, Mr. Patterson handed the financial evidence to the district attorney. The investigation moved quickly. Within months, Victoria, Marcus, and my parents were all charged with theft. They each pleaded guilty. Victoria received probation and had to repay over $100,000. Marcus received probation and repaid nearly $90,000. My parents received probation as well and repaid the remainder. None of them went to prison, but they all carried criminal records. My parents drove to Seattle and stood at my door looking like people who had aged 10 years overnight. I let them in. My mother apologized for how they had raised Victoria and Marcus, for how they had treated me, for stealing from Grandma. My father wanted to know if that was really all I had to say when I responded with a quiet, "Okay." I told them the truth. I had spent 27 years trying to be enough for this family, trying to be smart enough, successful enough, the right kind of daughter. There was always something wrong with me in their eyes. My job, my apartment, my choices, my life. When I finally moved away to protect my own peace, they made me the person everyone blamed. Only Grandma saw me clearly, and she had protected me in the only way she could. My father accused me of destroying the family. I told him I hadn't destroyed anything. They had made choices, and they were now facing the consequences of those choices. That was not destruction. That was accountability. At the sentencing, I stood before the judge and said that these people were my family, and I had loved them and still carried a part of that love. But they had stolen from someone who trusted them completely, and that was a betrayal of the deepest kind. My grandmother had come to this country with nothing and built something real through decades of sacrifice. She deserved better than to spend her final years being quietly robbed by the people she loved most. Afterward, Victoria passed me in the hallway and said they would never forgive me. I told her I was okay with that. And for the first time in my life, I really was. In the months that followed, I learned to steward what Grandma had left me. I met Jennifer, the property manager who had worked with Grandma for 20 years, and together we walked through all 9 buildings. I met the tenants by name, heard their stories, and understood for the first time what these properties really were. They were not investments. They were neighborhoods. They were little communities that Grandma had quietly held together for decades, remembering children's birthdays and fixing things herself into her 80s because she believed it showed respect. I kept Jennifer on, set aside money for repairs, and created a formal fund for tenants who fell on hard times, something Grandma had done quietly and alone for years. After all expenses, the buildings generated around $118,000 annually. Since my job as a software engineer paid my own bills, I used that income to start a scholarship in Grandma's name for first-generation college students, donate to immigrant support organizations, and fund programs helping elderly residents with housing costs. One evening, I received a text from Marcus. He said he was in therapy, trying to understand why he had done what he did, not asking for anything, just letting me know he was trying. I wrote back that I was glad, that I was in therapy too, and that maybe one day we could talk, but not yet. I needed more time. Uncle Wei called not long after. He told me that he and Aunt Lynn had talked at length about how they had watched me be pushed out of the family without ever saying a word to stop it, and that they were sorry. He asked if maybe, one day, we could share a meal with no agenda, no requests, just an attempt to do better. I told him maybe, and that I would think about it. He said that was all they could ask for. That night I sat down and wrote in my journal. I wrote to Grandma and told her that a year had passed since the will was read, and that everything had changed. I told her I finally understood why she had done what she did. She wasn't being cruel. She was being honest. She was honoring the truth about what each of us had chosen to be. I thanked her for seeing me when no one else did, for protecting me, for giving me something more valuable than property. She had given me proof that my feelings were real, that I was worthy of respect, and that I had the right to demand it. I stood outside the little house on Hawthorne Avenue one quiet afternoon, the first building she and Grandpa had bought in 1975, its garden tidy and its paint fresh. Jennifer stood beside me and said that Grandma would be very proud. I hoped so. I believed so. Because the buildings were still standing, the people inside them was still cared for, and the woman who built it all from nothing was still present in every small act of kindness we showed the ones who called those buildings home.